On May 14th, 1607, 6 Englishmen, Bartholomew Gosnold, George Kendall, John Martin, Christopher Newport, John Ratcliffe, and Edward Maria Wingfield, stood on the shore of a small and swampy peninsula jutting into the James River. After months spent crossing the Atlantic, and weeks spent exploring the Chesapeake Bay, they decided that this was where they would found a new colony, Jamestown. They were in what would become Virginia, 100 miles south of where Washington, D.C. was founded 2 centuries later, and a mere 15 miles west of Yorktown, where the British were to be forced out of America for good. Back in Europe, it was the age of Shakespeare and the King James Bible, and Galileo and Kepler. Although I'm sure their minds were far from history, they were about to do something historic. Hold the first election in British America. It was time to choose the first president of Jamestown. Yet although it was an election, it was hardly democratic. Of the 104 colonists who had come to Jamestown, only this council of 6 men would be allowed to vote. But it was a vote. They chose Edward Maria Wingfield. He was about 57, a former soldier, and one of the project's main financial backers. His tenure was catastrophic. In 4 months, half of the men would be dead, and Wingfield would find himself not only deposed, but arrested and in chains. Some of the other councilmen met even worse fates. Gosnold would be dead from disease within months. Kendall would be executed by firing squad the next year for an apparent conspiracy against the colonial government, and the year after that, Ratcliffe was skinned alive by Native Americans. It was a dismal beginning. Of the over 6,000 people who went to Jamestown, by 1625, only 1,200 would remain. A few managed to escape back to Europe, but the vast majority died from famine, disease, war, and massacres. But by the end of this period, Virginia would emerge with sustainable foundations, both economic and political. There would be a profitable export, tobacco, and there would be an elected assembly, the first in British America. The election that day in 1607 would not be a model for the future. The real precedents would come later. But however misguided, however tragic they were, those early years were the furthest headwaters of self-government in what would become the United States. And so it is here, at Jamestown, with these 6 men, that we begin the story of elections in America. Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 1, Introduction. As you may have guessed, this episode is meant to be a quick introduction to this podcast, a statement of purpose. I'm hoping for Early and Often to be a reasonably comprehensive overview of the history of self-government in the United States, all the way from the earliest colonial years to nearly the present. I'd like to cover a bit of everything, from presidential elections to state and local ones. From how people voted to why they voted. From who could vote to who they were voting for. It isn't meant to be a complete political history of the United States. I can't even begin to imagine how long that would take. But it will of course touch on every aspect of political life in America. That's why I chose this topic in the first place. Elections have been a constant feature in America for almost 400 years now. Elections are how we channel our disagreements. Who gets to vote has been one of the defining questions of our history. There's that saying you hear sometimes, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. Well, it does change things, and they did make it illegal for most people. People have fought for the right to vote. People have died for the right to vote. Voting really does matter. It may make things better, it may make things worse, but it does matter. Now, in the early years of colonial America, it has to be said that elections weren't that important. The real power was usually wielded by officials appointed in England. There were elections in the colonies from a very early date, but they were of secondary importance. They would grow in influence only slowly. So as a result, these early episodes will be as much about political history in general as about elections in particular. But I want to tell the story from the beginning, because I think that these early precedents are important. So these first few episodes will be jumping around from colony to colony a bit, back and forth in time, as we establish the basics. Then we can get to the electoral system as it starts to develop in earnest. Well, that about wraps up the introduction. I hope you'll stick with me, and I hope you'll find this topic as interesting and engaging as I do. Next episode, we'll get started by discussing the background of English colonization and the first years of Jamestown. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America.